these parties can do very little about the cost of living crisis. Of course, they can reduce taxes. This comes at the cost of higher debt.
Voters in 27 countries have elected a new European Parliament, and the message is clear. The bloc is shifting to the right. Populist and far-right parties made crucial gains, a reshuffle that will influence everything from trade to green policies. With me here to discuss the economic impact of the European election results is Clemens Fuest, president of the Ifo Institute for Economic Research. Clemens, far-right parties are usually more vocal on issues like culture and society. Briefly, what can we expect from them economically?
Economically, populist parties promise a lot. They promise more public services, and at the same time, they promise lower taxes. Of course, that doesn't work, but that's what they promise. They also blame economic problems a lot on foreigners. That's what they do.
Now let's have a quick look at the makeup of the new European Parliament. The centre-right, the European People's Party, scored a clear victory. It remains the largest group, but the biggest swings are at the ends of the political spectrum, with voters turning their backs on Europe's green parties. They lost 18 seats. At the same time, voters are looking towards the Identity and Democracy group. They won 9 seats. That group includes far-right nationalist and populist parties. So there's a lot of change happening in the parliament. How are businesses reacting to the shift?
Not very favorably. On capital markets, at least, we see today that investors seem to expect more conflict. We've seen the interest rate spreads rising. That means they expect more conflicts among the member states about public debt, for instance. They see greater risk in France and Italy. And businesses are certainly concerned about stability and about openness towards trade. A lot of populist parties don't like international trade. They don't like migration. And that can be a problem for businesses.
Now, you just mentioned debt. The European Central Bank recently warned that some European countries are spending too much money. France and Italy in particular are running higher budget deficits than EU rules permit. Now, in both of those countries, far-right parties, the National Rally and the Brothers of Italy, won the most votes. How do you expect the right swing to affect Europe's debt problems?
Well, I think there is a real danger here, because what populist parties normally do is, because they promise a lot and don't raise taxes, they go deeper into debt. So these already highly indebted countries would probably get into more difficulties with populist governments, and that can give rise to conflicts, because there's no doubt that they would shift economic problems they then get into, that they would blame the EU, among others, for these problems, arguing, like we've seen in the past, that yes, the EU with its rules prevents them from doing the right policies and restricts their room for action. So there is a conflict looming there.
Now, as you mentioned, these far-right parties are pro more public spending. They address the cost of living concerns that many voters have. So at a time where voters' budgets are squeezed by inflation, is it maybe not so wrong to focus on these concerns?
Well, at first glance, yes, but if you think about it, these parties can do very little about the cost of living crisis. Of course, they can reduce taxes, but this comes at the cost of higher debt, and that will make things more difficult for these highly indebted countries. They can offer temporary relief, yes, but no permanent fix. And I think that is the challenge here. So things will only get worse. They may get a little better in the short term, but then they will get worse.
Now, in Italy, far-right politician Giorgia Meloni has been prime minister for 1.5 years, and the Italian economy has actually been growing and growing faster than Germany. So things are looking bright, actually, in Italy economically. Could this all be a bit of fear-mongering, perhaps?
Well, things are looking okay in Italy at the moment because Italy gets a lot of money from Europe and in the context of the next generation EU. Countries of the north are incurring debt to pay transfers to Italy, and Italy has benefited from that. At the same time, Italy is increasing its own debt. So I would say that's a policy which is not sustainable in the long term. Of course, Meloni has been moderate because she didn't want to put at risk the transfers she gets from Brussels, and we'll have to see whether that continues. But it's not a sustainable policy. These transfers will not be paid forever. Italy cannot increase its debt forever. So I would think it's not a sustainable strategy.
Clemens, one of the EU's strongest competencies is in trade, and global trade is in a tight spot. Europe is facing major tensions with China, and a trade agreement between the EU and South America is still waiting to be signed. Now, hard-right parties are often not big on free trade. They think more in terms of national borders economically. So how might this new European Parliament impact how the EU trades with others?
I think that's one of the issues here. It's really getting more difficult. The EU desperately needs new trade partners because the EU depends much more on foreign trade than countries like the US or China. So it would be wise to diversify trade, include partners other than China. But that will be made difficult, as you say, by all these parties, these extremist parties who are against trade. They will protect interests of special groups, and it's unlikely. I think it has become more unlikely that we will get these trade agreements.
Until now, the EU has been putting the Green Deal at the center of its policies. It's a plan to invest hundreds of billions of euros into a more sustainable economy. What do these election results mean for the Green Deal?
I mean, that depends, of course, on the coalitions formed, but it's likely that the Green Deal will be deprioritized. That doesn't have to be bad. I think there's a couple of policy errors that have been made in the context of the Green Deal. We have got a lot of very bureaucratic rules, like the EU taxonomy on sustainable finance, like the Energy Efficiency Directive, that limits energy consumption for no good reason. So we've seen quite a lot of bad policies in the context of the Green Deal, but the good policies, which also exist, are certainly a danger. For instance, can we still increase CO2 pricing? We need to increase CO2 pricing if we want to decarbonize, but will right-wing extremist parties support that? I guess the answer is no. So there will be more resistance against the reasonable parts of the Green Deal.
Now, Europe is also grappling with a skilled labor shortage. How might a rise in anti-immigration parties affect the bloc's chances of attracting new talent from abroad that the bloc needs to fuel its economy?
That will probably also be made more difficult. It is true that immigration policy as it is at the moment is not great in Europe because there's a lot of illegal immigration, there is disorderly immigration, but it's hard to imagine that Europe will be more welcoming for highly skilled people or for people willing to work with this shift to the extreme right. And if we scale down immigration into the labor market, we will have even bigger problems with declining labor force.
Now, the EU will also be negotiating its next 7-year budget soon and deciding how much money to spend and what to spend it on. The Parliament has to sign off on that budget. If the green industry might lose out, as you mentioned, which areas do you expect will receive more funding with this new European Parliament?
Well, green funding was mostly based on Next Generation EU, which will be phased out anyway. So there is not so much green funding in the core budget, but still there is some, and probably, yes, this will be reduced, and it'll be interesting to see where this is going. One option would be that it is shifted towards defense spending and things, but defense is currently not a competence of the EU, so there are some activities there. I would think maybe more will be going into regional policies, because regional interests are parties. Of course, again, a lot will depend on the coalition prevailing in the European Parliament. If the other parties come together and form a coalition and exclude the extreme right, in that case, the moderate Conservative Party will have more influence. Again, I could imagine that regional interests, that farming interests will be a little stronger.
Clemens Fuest, thank you for talking to us.
Thank you very much.